potential to reverse all of those sources of greenhouse gas emissions is what gives people this really, some people, this optimistic view that by helping farmers and ranchers to shift their management practices, we could really have an impact on climate change. This is an analysis, this table right here is an analysis that was done for Africa, and it shows the economically, in other words, what would be economically feasible, not the biophysically feasible, which is far, far larger, but the economically viable practices. And what they find is that about 25% of that potential is through improving grazing land management. And another 25, I think, let's see, another 12% of that is by restoring degraded lands, much of which is in the grazing lands. As I said before, what you need in any particular landscape depends on what your goals and objectives are. What kind of food production needs do you have? What kind of watershed management needs do you have? What is the land use pattern? So different kinds of places, these are just 4 places that we've done some work before, show that you need very different strategies. And that means you really need to have locally designed responses to these potentials and to these issues. One size does definitely not fit all. But the potential is really great. This is just an example from Drakensberg, South Africa, from quite a large-scale initiative that was done by about 300 ranchers that were down there, where they started up with a very highly degraded area. And their motivation was actually not about climate. Their motivation was about productivity. Their motivation was about water management. Their motivation was about air quality. What they did was a series of interventions around fire management, stock management, how they burn, the frequency of burning, their grazing practices, their movement practices, the restoration of grassland, and the restoration of some sort of important endangered botanical species. And as a result of this really impacted the vegetative cover quite dramatically within this area. And this is really what they ended up with. And it was a far more productive and economically viable production system for the farmers involved. And all of that grass and all of those roots and all of those trees and all of those uneroded soils the estimates were made, it had a dramatic impact on the amount of carbon that was stored within that large landscape. This is another completely different kind of a situation. This is from Costa Rica, and this is a dairy farming area that is very productive. It's the most important dairy source within this part of Costa Rica, but it's also right next to one of the most important protected areas for biodiversity within Costa Rica and part of a very large Mesoamerica biological corridor. And so the challenge here was how could dairy farmers very significantly increase their productivity of dairy farming. They also produced coffee and a number of other products in ways that would enhance ecosystem services in this landscape. Again, their motivation was not climate, because this really started happening about 20 years ago before anybody was talking about climate change. But all the things that they did in this landscape to improve productivity, to protect biodiversity. And I've got the different numbers here showing some of the different interventions that were done by different farmers and different land management organizations in different parts of the landscape. And they ranged from actually turning marginal range of grazing land back into forest. It included planting higher yielding varieties of grasses for livestock feed, so that they actually they produced much more feed and needed less land to do so. They also established windbreaks, networks of windbreaks. That's the sort of the number 6 item that was there, that provided ecological connectivity between different patches of the protected forest. And they also put in erosion controls, as you see in number 4. And they did this through trees and shrubs that, again, sequestered a great deal of carbon, as well as providing windbreaks that reduced mortality of livestock and also reduced damage from winds for their coffee yield. So there were very significant economic benefits from them being involved in these kind of activities. So what are the financial incentives for farmers and ranchers to really become carbon ranchers? At this moment in time, the principal financial benefits are the first 3 that I have on that list there. Improving your livestock health and productivity, reducing your risks, increasing your land values. These are the reasons that many of you are here today involved in sustainable ranching methods. And I think at this moment in time, those are still the best Still very strong rationale for doing this, and seeing climate change mitigation as a co-benefit of what else you're doing. But increasingly, we are seeing and will see a number of new financial instruments being developed that will, as soon as more policymakers do understand this, I think we're going to start to see a number of new kinds of instruments. I wanted to comment yesterday on David's talk that I'm actually far more optimistic than I was even just a few years ago about the international policy environment. Constance and I just came from Amsterdam, where we were attending the first ever international meeting on agriculture, food security, and climate change. And there were 60 ministers of agriculture there. That's like Tom Vilsack's level. The U.S. sent people, Tom did not come, but others did, to really talk about this challenge. And day after day, people were talking about exactly these kinds of land management practices for multiple reasons, in part for climate change mitigation. They are particularly concerned with doing the very same things for climate change adaptation. All the things that we showed from the Drakensberg example and from the Costa Rica example had they were going to help farmers manage the risks of a riskier climate. But some of the things that we're starting to see are a shift in farm bill type payments around the world, where farmers are being supported to do land restoration, to do better management practices for grazing land from farmers and ranchers that clearly are climate friendly. And that's really beginning to burgeon, and still at a small scale, but I think it's got potential. There's also new sources of financing that ranchers and farmers who are doing good climate management for mitigation and adaptation are able to get lower interest rates or preferred clients for particular sources of financing. We're seeing really interesting, very recent growth in the development of certifications that are specifically for climate change. Now, there's quite a few in terms of farm crops, but we're just, I think in the last year, have seen Rainforest Alliance now has a sustainable ranching certification. There's a number of ones where they're now going to have eco-labels that show that this meat, this dairy product, or these other kinds of products from the farm are climate friendly. You're starting to see a number of actually large food industry actors, groups like Nestle, who buy an awful lot of milk around the world. They are trying to go through their supply chain system and rejigger it to ensure that they cannot be blamed for contributing to climate change as a result of all the milk that they're selling. And they're doing the same thing with cocoa and a number of other products that they're major international buyers for. So they're trying to work through the supply chain so that the farmers who are supplying them with their product, they can be sure are doing the most possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also offset them with sequestration.